The year 2007 marked a turning point in West Bengal's political landscape. The catalyst was a seemingly innocuous economic project, a chemical hub in Nandigram. The state government, led by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, envisioned a special economic zone, or SEZ. This SEZ, they argued, would bring much-needed investment and jobs to the region. However, the proposed site for this industrial behemoth was 10,000 acres of fertile farmland in Nandigram. The government's plan was met with immediate resistance from the local population, primarily farmers who depended on the land for their livelihood. For them, the SEZ represented not progress, but displacement and dispossession. Their anxieties were further fueled by the lack of transparency in the government's dealings and the paltry compensation offered for their land. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences. The government's insistence on acquiring land for the SEZ stemmed from its belief in large-scale industrialization as the panacea for West Bengal's economic woes. The state had witnessed decades of industrial decline, and the left-front government saw the SEZ as a way to attract foreign investment and revive the economy. The Salam Group of Indonesia emerged as a potential investor, promising to set up a chemical plant within the SEZ. The government believed that the project would generate employment opportunities and boost the local economy. However, the government's economic rationale failed to consider the social and human costs of its ambitious plan. The farmers of Nandigram, deeply connected to their land, were unwilling to make way for an industry they saw as a threat to their way of life. The government's top-down approach, coupled with its failure to engage in meaningful dialogue with the affected communities, created a sense of resentment and distrust that would soon boil over. The farmers of Nandigram, facing the prospect of losing their land, were not going down without a fight. They found strength in unity, forming local committees to organize and resist the government's acquisition drive. Two groups emerged as the vanguard of this resistance: the Bhoomi Raksha Committee, or Land Protection Committee, and the Bhumi Ushed Pratirod Committee, also known as the Committee Against Land Eviction, or BUPC. These committees, comprising farmers, local leaders, and activists, mobilized the villagers and galvanized opposition to the SEZ. They challenged the government's claims of development, arguing that it would come at the cost of their livelihoods and the environment. The committees organized protests, rallies, and roadblocks, effectively cutting off access to Nandigram for government officials and potential investors. The resistance in Nandigram was not merely about land, it was about a way of life. The farmers, many of whom had inherited their land from their forefathers, saw it as more than just a source of income. It was their identity, their heritage, their connection to their ancestors. The government's attempt to wrest control of this land was seen as an assault on their very being. Moreover, the resistance was fueled by a deep-seated distrust of the government and its intentions. The farmers felt that they were being treated as pawns in a larger game of economic development, their voices silenced, their concerns ignored. The committees provided them with a platform to articulate their grievances, to challenge the government's narrative, and to assert their right to their land and their livelihoods. The simmering tension in Nandigram reached a boiling point on March 14, 2007. The government, determined to break the deadlock and assert its authority, decided to use force. A large contingent of police, estimated to be over 3,000 strong, entered Nandigram, armed with tear gas, batons, and firearms. Their mission was to disperse the protesting villagers and pave the way for land acquisition. The villagers, however, were prepared to defend their land with their lives. They had erected barricades, dug trenches, and armed themselves with whatever they could find: sticks, stones, and even homemade bombs. The ensuing clash was brutal and one-sided. The police opened fire on the unarmed villagers, killing at least 14 people, according to official figures, and injuring scores more. The events of March 14, 2007, sent shockwaves throughout West Bengal and beyond. The images of police brutality, the cries of the wounded, and the sight of lifeless bodies lying in pools of blood were beamed across the nation, exposing the human cost of the government's development agenda. The Nandigram massacre, as it came to be known, became a symbol of state oppression and the limits of peaceful dissent. The government's attempt to justify the use of force as a necessary measure to maintain law and order rang hollow. The disproportionate response to the villagers' protest, the indiscriminate firing on unarmed civilians, and the subsequent attempts to downplay the casualties only served to further erode public trust in the government and fuel the flames of resistance. Section 4. From the Ashes of Nandigram, the Rise of Mamata Banerjee. The Nandigram violence had a profound impact on West Bengal's political landscape. It marked a turning point in the fortunes of the ruling left-front government, which had been in power for over 3 decades. The incident exposed the government's authoritarian tendencies, its disconnect from the people, and its willingness to use force to quell dissent. On the other hand, the Nandigram massacre catapulted Mamata Banerjee, the firebrand leader of the Trinamool Congress, to the forefront of state politics. Banerjee, known for her populist rhetoric and her ability to connect with the masses, seized upon the Nandigram tragedy to launch a scathing attack on the left-front government. She visited the families of the victims, provided them with legal and financial assistance, and turned Nandigram into a rallying cry for her party's campaign against the government. Banerjee shrewdly tapped into the growing discontent among the rural population, who felt marginalized and ignored by the left-front government. She positioned herself as the champion of the poor and the downtrodden, the voice of the voiceless. Her slogan, Ma Mati Manush, Mother Motherland People, resonated deeply with the masses who saw in her a leader who understood their pain and aspirations. The Nandigram incident provided Banerjee with the ammunition she needed to launch a full-blown assault on the left-front government. She accused the government of being anti-farmer, anti-poor, and anti-people. She highlighted the government's failures on multiple fronts, from economic stagnation to law and order, and promised a new dawn for West Bengal under her leadership. Section 5. A Global Outcry, Human Rights Violations in the Spotlight. The violence in Nandigram did not go unnoticed by the international community. Human rights organizations both within India and abroad condemned the government's actions and called for an independent investigation into the killings. Amnesty International, in a scathing report, accused the West Bengal government of using excessive force against unarmed civilians and failing to protect the rights of its citizens. The report highlighted the plight of the villagers who had been displaced from their homes, living in makeshift camps, and denied access to basic amenities. It also documented cases of intimidation, harassment, and violence against those who dared to speak out against the government. The Amnesty International report brought international attention to the human rights violations in Nandigram, putting further pressure on the government to address the situation. The Nandigram incident became a test case for India's commitment to human rights and its image as a vibrant democracy. The government's heavy-handed response to the protests, its attempts to suppress dissent, and its failure to protect its own citizens raised serious questions about its respect for democratic values. The international outcry forced the government to take cognizance of the situation and take steps to address the concerns raised by human rights organizations. The Nandigram incident also highlighted the growing influence of civil society and the media in holding the government accountable. Despite attempts by the government to control the narrative and restrict access to information, human rights organizations and journalists played a crucial role in exposing the truth about the violence and its aftermath. Their efforts ensured that the voices of the victims were heard and that the government was held responsible for its actions. Section 6. The Unending Struggle, Cycles of Violence and Displacement. The violence in Nandigram did not end with the March 14th massacre. It marked the beginning of a protracted and bloody conflict between the state government and the villagers, who were determined to protect their land at all costs. The government, instead of engaging in dialogue and seeking a peaceful resolution, responded with further repression, fueling a cycle of violence and displacement. In November 2007, another wave of violence erupted in Nandigram as villagers who had been displaced from their homes attempted to return. The returning villagers were met with stiff resistance from armed groups allegedly backed by the ruling party. The clashes resulted in more deaths, injuries, and destruction of property, further deepening the divide between the government and the people. The violence in Nandigram had a devastating impact on the lives of ordinary people. Thousands were forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in makeshift camps, where they lived in squalor without access to basic amenities. The trauma of witnessing violence, losing loved ones, and being uprooted from their homes left deep scars on the psyche of the villagers, many of whom continue to grapple with the psychological and emotional consequences of the conflict. The cycle of violence and displacement in Nandigram exposed the deep-seated flaws in the state's approach to development. The government's single-minded focus on economic growth, at the expense of social justice and environmental sustainability, had created a breeding ground for conflict. The use of force, instead of dialogue and consensus building, only served to exacerbate the situation, pushing the region further into chaos and instability.